So, Steven Crowder decided to make a video called Crusades Debunked. And when I saw this in my recommended list, I was just like, okay, it's Steven Crowder talking about the Crusades. And not only that, but supposedly he's debunked the Crusades. What's he talking about? So, I watched the video and I was absolutely horrified. So, first of all, Stephen starts off, and his whole crux of this video, by the way, is that supposedly people in the West are using the Crusades as some sort of forgiving mechanism. Because we did all these atrocities in the Crusades, this somehow excuses Muslims and gives them and gives them an excuse to attack us. That couldn't be further from the truth. Now, he uses an actual quote from Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton said that people still talk about the Crusades in the Middle East. And yes, if you have ever been to the Middle East, you know that to be true. They still talk about it. They still talk about it like it happened yesterday, which is the thing, because the Crusades and the violence of what the Christians did to the Muslims during that time is still highly talked about. It is still talked about and used by ISIS as a recruitment tool, by the way, and Al-Qaeda, and a lot of extremist Muslim groups. Why? Because if you take the look, and you look at the view of the Crusades from the Islamic view, which, if you are a historian, you should do, because you always need to look at both sides in history. And you look at what the Muslim scholars were writing about as what these, Christians were doing, and what the feeling of the world, of the Islamic world in general. They generally thought that the Christians were coming to end them. And you cannot blame them, because the Christians were committing horrific act after horrific act. And they didn't think they'd stop. Well, they did stop, because they got to Jerusalem and just went, okay, it's ours now. And he goes on to say that, he calls this idea of the Christian writer wrote that when the Christians took Jerusalem, they basically said that they had blood. They were walking in blood up to their ankles, and Crowder just goes, "Oh, that's impossible." Of course it's impossible. What he was doing was basically evidently using his poetic license to go, the Christians are literally committing such acts that they are covered in blood. And that wherever they are walking, they get covered in blood up to their ankles. That is not in dispute. And yet Crowder just washes it away. It's just like, when the Christians took Jerusalem, they did nothing. They did nothing. Please. They might have killed a couple of, butchered all of the inhabitants. They might have even, butchered, the Christian inhabitants that lived there because they couldn't tell the difference between them. Whoops. Whoa, those cheeky crusaders. And that's literally what he does for the rest of the video. And then he uses it, of course, as an excuse to attack Muslims. Which is ridiculous. It's just so wrong and dishonest. And then, of course, he talks about the rules of war. Of course, the Crusaders and people in the medieval times ignored this completely, Stephen. It's written right in the Bible, "Thou shalt not kill," which was a massive problem for Christians. because they were constantly warring with each other. In fact, they came up with this thing called the mace so they could kill each other bloodlessly. But of course, you know, real historical, you know, facts and what went on in the Middle Ages doesn't matter to Stephen, because Stephen's got a political agenda. Now, of course, he has a problem with the left politicising the Crusades, and he doesn't do a good enough job of saying what the arguments the left are making about the Crusades. I don't know what they are, because Stephen didn't mention them. He just said, they're using the Crusades, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, what's this argument people are using, Stephen? I have never once heard someone from the left try and, you know, justify the Crusades to use as a modern context for some sort of, you know, apologist to Muslims. I have never heard that. You're the first person I've heard it from. And yet here you are doing what you complain about. And then you go on and awfully cherry pick events of history and just go, oh, the Crusaders were entirely justified in doing it. When they weren't. There were clear rules of war that basically said, if someone once a city has surrendered to you, you are not allowed to sack it. And guess what the Christians did? They sacked it and massacred their inhabitants. And there were, and one siege in particular, Stephen, which you seem just to not mention, is the siege of Masal, where after the battle, the Christians tore open the stomachs of its inhabitants to check for valuables, because apparently there was this rumour going around that Turks were invincible because they ate jewels. So the Christians tore them open. And then, just to, you know, top it off, because the Christians were having a lack of food, so instead of, you know, moving off to find some food, they instead decided to eat the rest of the inhabitants of the city. This is an event that is still talked about today in the Middle East. But of course, this doesn't matter to Stephen, because he'd rather use history as a political tool. Something which apparently has a problem people using history as a political tool, but he has no problem when he himself decides to use history as a political tool.